You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I've always wanted to do something in finance, so I did study at the University of Glasgow for a degree in accountancy with international finance. For the last 12 years, we have worked alongside the World Bank and Insol, improving insolvency frameworks across African countries. So it is extremely important that the African Union and also the other regional blocs like ECOWAS and the SADC and the others get together and try to improve their fortunes from within.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest. We have Amaechi Nsofor, who is a partner and head of Africa Insolvency and Asset Recovery at Grant Thornton. And his multi-award winning and renowned team has pioneered the use of insolvency powers to facilitate litigation, trace, and recover misappropriated assets. Sounds exciting, sounds interesting. Welcome to the podcast, Amaechi. How are you?
I'm doing well. Excited to be here. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm good. It's great to have you on the podcast. I know we've been having this discussion for quite a while and we finally managed to get a date and time together. So it's great to have you here.
Yeah, entirely my fault. I do spend quite a lot of time traveling across the continent. So I've been in a fair few countries in Africa in the last 6 weeks. So it's good to be in the UK and able to speak on this podcast today.
Fantastic. And hopefully we'll hear about some of the stories or some of the activities that you've been up to during your time traveling across the continent. I'm not sure if you listened to the podcast before, but I usually like to start from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Amaechi Nsofor.
Yeah, I'll start from the beginning. I was brought up in Glasgow, in Scotland. I was born in Glasgow, moved back to my home country, which is Nigeria, to attend secondary school. This was years and years ago. And I'd always wanted to do something in finance. So I did end up studying at the University of Glasgow for a degree in accountancy with international finance, because always having that international angle was very important to me. And that's what brought me into the world of working for an accounting firm and qualifying as a chartered accountant. And then for the last 22 or 23 years, I've been practicing as a restructuring and solvency practitioner. So that is a very brief canter through my personal and professional history.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Amaechi. So you've given us great insight into your professional and personal career and life. Studied a degree in accountancy and international finance, which has led you to work with Grant Thornton, and you lead Grant Thornton UK's unique Africa practice, which specializes, I believe, in deploying and executing solutions across sub-Saharan Africa. What are some of these solutions that you deploy across the continent?
Yeah, it really covers the life cycle of problems and opportunities that companies and countries face in their lifetime. But what I would say is the foundation for what I do rests on being able to unlock capital that is tied up in an area that it shouldn't be tied up, and reallocating that capital into, an area that it will be put to better work for the company or for, the public, people who reside in that country. So the contexts are quite different depending on if you're looking at it from a corporate perspective or if you're looking at it on a country perspective. So, we can go through both of them on this call, subject to time being available.
Fantastic. So you've detailed you are passionate about capital reallocation. So for the people who are listening who aren't very familiar with what that is or what the concept is, can you explain the concept of capital reallocation and how or why you believe it can positively impact African economies?
Yeah, I will use the corporate or the company example to just demonstrate that. But just in short, what it means is that we've got billions of capital trapped in the wrong places. When you look at it from a company point of view, that usually manifests itself in companies which are, not performing as strongly or which have actually ceased trading, but there's still some debts or some assets within the company that need to be pursued, found, sold, and then the cash returned to creditors or the banks who are the ultimate borrowers. In the context of companies, we have a lot of what are known as zombie companies across Africa, actually globally, but the problem is more persistent in Africa. So these zombie companies, the zombies, are basically companies that are not trading or are under trading, not trading to the potential that they should be. And, in an efficient economy, what should happen, and this is part of, I guess, natural selection, is that those companies should be, turned around, they should be restructured. Or if a restructuring is not possible, the capital that's invested in them should be covered, should be realized using the powers of an insolvency practitioner. And then that capital can then be lent out to industries and companies that would better use that capital to drive economic growth.
Fantastic, thank you. So you mentioned that there are billions of capital tied up in the wrong place and the benefits of releasing this capital. So with that in mind, in terms of there are benefits that can be derived from it, what is currently hindering effective capital reallocation in African companies and how can this be addressed?
Oh, that's a great question. There are two things, really, I would say. Well, more than two, but I'll just focus on two for the purposes of the podcast. Firstly, it's about having efficient laws and regulations to ensure that you can get hold of those companies and you can get the assets, find the assets, enforce on the assets and recover the cash. So these are usually the insolvency laws and regulations that exist in different countries, because each country will have their own insolvency law. For the last 12 years, we have worked alongside the World Bank and Insol, improving insolvency frameworks across multiple African countries. And, we've come a long way from where we were when we started this journey. So it's created a more enabling environment, which will allow people like me with my skills and my team to go in there and, enforce security on behalf of creditors to get their money back in the simplest manner. So that's one part of it, the laws and the regulations, the insolvency law. The other part is funding. So having the cash to recruit skilled people, not just insolvency practitioners, but also lawyers, M&A experts, independent valuation experts, etc., who are all part of the team that would be deployed to take over a company and recover the assets. So as part of a solution for that, we recently set up an asset recovery fund within Grant Thornton as a separate entity that has raised a couple of $100 million of institutional investor money. And we are the sole advisors to that asset recovery fund. And that fund buys up non-performing loans, and it also buys up claims that creditors have. And we use our skills to enforce judgments to enable recovery of security on behalf of those creditors.
Amazing. So you mentioned one element. Efficient laws and regulations are required to address these challenges. So, with that in mind, could you provide some examples of, say, successful capital reallocation initiatives in Africa that have resulted, say, in significant improvements for industries or regions?
Yeah, I mean, there are numerous rescues, business rescues that have taken place in the last couple of years and probably longer. And the reason why I'm focusing on business rescue is if you go back 10 years ago, most of the insolvency regimes in Africa did not have an element of business rescue within them. So when a business gets into difficulty, it was either the company gets liquidated or the company just sat there as a zombie, not achieving much. Liquidation is the opposite of business rescue. Liquidation means the company ceases to trade and gets dissolved. Value is significantly destroyed and everybody loses out. Jobs are lost, etc. So the importance of business rescue cannot be underplayed, really. In the last couple of years, we have worked on a restructuring plan, engagements concerning Smile Telecoms, which is a Pan-African 4G LTE telecoms company. And we managed to rescue the company by using the restructuring plan framework in the UK. That's just one example out of many that are out there.
So if we look at it, I guess, from a sovereign and state level, how can the unlocking of billions of dollars of cash contribute to the sustainable development and economic growth in whether Africa-wide or specific African markets?
Yeah, I do like to position what I'm about to say carefully, because the problem I'm going to highlight here is one that exists globally. It's not just an African thing, but we specialize in what's known as contentious insolvency. And that's really where we utilize our skills and the tools available to us as insolvency practitioners to deal with situations where there's been fraud or where there's been corruption. Now, when you look at that on a sovereign level, in Africa, I think the last time I checked, there was a figure of about $60 billion being lost every year from Africa due to illicit financial flows. So most of that cash ends up in offshore jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands, Cayman, and other tax havens. So what we do with our skills and the tools available to us is firstly corporate intelligence and deploying corporate intelligence to help states find where the cash or where the assets have gone. And then once we found out where the assets are, we come up with strategies to recover those assets on behalf of the sovereign. And then the third thing, which is the most important to me, because that's where you seem to be adding value, is you then return or repatriate that cash back to the country that has lost the funds.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, I mean, in terms of where the assets are recovered, does there seem to be a specific trend of the flows or the direction of those assets?
Yes and no. Yes, there's certain patterns. The trend is that usually the funds do not stay locally. And I think somebody must have done a really good sales job with regions like the BVI and Cayman. They are tax havens. So when people steal or loot from the government coffers, they do tend to try to stick the cash in safe havens where they think they'll be protected by secrecy laws. Because if you compare the level of public disclosure in the UK, for example, you could go into Companies House in the UK, do a search in anybody's name or any company's name, and you pick out details about, the entity, who the directors are, when it was registered, accounts, etc. Now, you don't get that level of visibility in places like the BVI and Cayman. So we tend to find out that those funds do end up in places like that. But then, the other aspect of it is property. People like to buy property. So, some of the most expensive real estate in the world are on the streets of London. So quite a lot of the properties in the highbrow areas in London are actually the targets that we find ourselves going after. The difficulty or the challenge that we face is that these assets or these properties are not normally held in the names of the individuals who've stolen the cash. They'll either use proxies to hold the properties, or they will use entities that are registered in the BVI or Cayman to hold those properties.
Interesting. So I guess looking at it from a government level, how can governments and, say, policymakers encourage or facilitate capital reallocation in Africa? Are there any specific measures or like policy measures that you would recommend?
There are a couple actually, and there are parallels to be drawn with what I said earlier on the corporate side. Firstly, those laws have to be in place; those regulations have to be in place to make sure you can tackle people who are laundering money. So anti-money laundering laws, and then proceeds of crime acts, POCA legislation needs to be tightened up within those countries. The next step would be to energize the local law enforcement. That's usually not just the police and the Ministry of Justice, but it's also the anti-corruption commissions that exist within those countries. Give them the power and the funding to be able to bring claims against individuals or corporates who have stolen funds. And then the last part of it would be cooperation with not just foreign law enforcement, so the likes of the NCA in the UK and the SFO in the UK, but also with private practitioners like ourselves, because the private practitioners are the ones that don't have any budget or capacity constraints when it comes to deploying people to trace and recover assets.
Thank you for that. So, as we discussed earlier, the potential benefits of capital reallocation is the stimulation of economies and industries. So, are there any specific industries or sectors in Africa that you believe are particularly ripe for capital reallocation?
Yeah, they are actually. I mean, one of the biggest ones is infrastructure. I mean, the infrastructure gap in Africa is close to $200 billion per annum. So every year, $200 billion more needs to be spent across Africa to improve the airports, the roads, and all the links within Africa. Now, if that doesn't happen, I don't think any of the gains that were expected from the African Continental Free Trade Agreements will ever be realized. When you speak to people like myself who travel extensively within Africa, you'd be surprised to find out that it's sometimes easier to fly from Lomé back to Paris and then directly from Lomé into Liberia, or fly to Doha and then fly back into Africa, because just those links just do not exist. So I would say, if I had a magic wand, I would say infrastructure would be the focus and the place I would put the most energy into.
Fantastic. So you touched upon after the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So with capital reallocation, do we see any challenges or difficulties trying to reallocate capital across African borders?
The key challenges I see are probably challenges that are being addressed by the Continental Free Trade Agreements. One of them is the free flow of people. I know immigration is a very, very sensitive and emotive and topical point at the moment. But without the free movement of people and goods across borders, you're never going to realize the potential in intra-African trade, which is where the growth should be. And then the other challenge I see is in the harmonization of laws across different countries, because we've got this split in Africa between, the common law jurisdictions, which are usually Commonwealth, English speaking, the Anglophone countries. And then you have the civil law or HADA law, which is pretty much mostly Francophone. And then you have some countries that are hybrid of common law and civil. So unless you can harmonize all those laws, you're not going to get people and companies comfortable with signing agreements in one country, then going across the border to the next one and, signing a similar agreement. It's just going to be very, very, very difficult.
As you mentioned, in terms of after, it does depend on collaboration and cooperation of different African nations. So how important is collaboration and cooperation between African countries in achieving successful capital reallocation?
Yeah, it's extremely important. I mean, we've just returned from a trip to the Seychelles where I was speaking at the Commonwealth Heads of Anti-Corruption event. And, it was an honor to be one of the few private sector practitioners that was speaking at that event amongst a lineup that included a lot of public sector bodies. The theme of that conference was all about collaboration to fight corruption. And it was about collaboration across borders to fight corruption. Now, if you don't have the different African countries looking out for each other, sharing best practice with each other in order to improve and enhance their capabilities, then I don't think, and I'm speaking as an African, then I don't think Africa should be looking outside of Africa if it cannot solve or cannot try to solve its problems within Africa initially. So it is extremely important that the African Union and also the other regional blocs like ECOWAS and the SADC and the others get together and try to improve their fortunes from within.
So we've discussed, I guess, the benefits of capital reallocation, also the benefits of collaboration and cooperation between different African countries. So if you look at capital reallocation in terms of the risks and pitfalls, what are some of the risks and pitfalls associated with capital reallocation? And what do you do to mitigate some of these risks?
When it comes to capital in Africa, one of the key risks are around foreign exchange. So you have a situation whereby the United States dollar remains the reserve currency of choice, and it's going to be a situation that's going to continue for a while. Well, I hope the situation with the debt ceiling gets resolved shortly. But yeah, that's going to be a situation that's going to remain for a while. Now, when you have a situation where entities and governments are borrowing in US dollars, but they are investing locally in their local currency, and then they're earning income in their local currency on those investments, but they have to repay loans that are denominated in a foreign currency. It introduces a huge gap in expectations in the ability to repay loans, particularly when the US dollar strengthens against local currencies, which has been, frankly, the trend for the last, 30, 40, probably even longer years. So that would be one of the key risks I would say. And then the other one would be inflation. So you manage to get capital out of a pocket where it's being trapped. So you reallocate it to somewhere else within Africa. And then you find out that inflation running at high double digits percentages erodes the capital that you have reallocated. And sometimes it might actually be better off just leaving the capital trapped where it is if it's in the right currency and it's not in a high inflationary environment, than reallocating into an area where the currency is going to get wiped out, both through the FX devaluation, but also through inflation. I think that the mitigation is in trying to make sure you have a natural hedge as much as possible. So you need to make sure that if you're borrowing in a foreign currency, that you're also maybe incurring expenses in a foreign currency, or you're earning income in a foreign currency so that you can repay those loans. So trying to carry a natural hedge will be one of the ways you could mitigate that risk. The other way could be by way of hedging products from banks or financial institutions, but those tend to be quite expensive. And when margins are tight, you really don't want to be eroding margins through onerous financial burdens.
Thank you for sharing that, Amaechi. I guess this can be seen as quite high level, extremely technical, and almost bureaucratic in terms of the involvement and what's required to reallocate capital. So I was wondering, in terms of the process, is there ever a role for, say, technology and innovation to play in facilitating capital reallocation, reducing the risk, and ensuring there's transparency in the process?
Yes, I mean, that's very, very important. I mean, the technology it's moved at breathtaking speed over the last few years, particularly with the advances in blockchain technology. We have set up a team within Grant Thornton that specializes in blockchain technology and crypto and how to identify where capital has been tied up, particularly in crypto assets.
Oh, interesting.
Being able to access those amounts and being able to recover those amounts for creditors. So that team is extremely busy at the moment, dealing with a lot of inquiries and live engagements.
Awesome. That's good to hear. So I guess if we look at it from another perspective, as an individual such as yourself who is passionate about capital reallocation in Africa, are there any actions or steps that an ordinary citizen can take to support the efforts and create positive change with regards to this?
Yes, there are at different levels. I think people who don't work in the sector that I do can make sure that they're holding people in positions of power to account, to actually inquire as to what policies are in place to ensure that capital is brought back into Africa. There's an example, of really positive outcome from this with the I'm sure you're aware of the Abacha monies from Nigeria,
Yes.
Which were trapped in Switzerland and Ireland. And, it took millions of Nigerians to ask the question of the government. This was, years ago, as to when are these funds going to be coming back? And due to that pressure locally, and then later on international pressure, the Swiss got together with Nigeria and also the Irish and the governments in Jersey. And as a result of that, over $400 million has been returned back to Nigeria in the last 4 or 5 years. So the man or the woman the person on the street can do something to make sure that this becomes a focal point for the people in positions of power.
Fantastic. So you've agreed, obviously, ordinary citizens can play a part in the successful capital reallocation for future prosperity and growth. So if we look at the future, what are your future goals and aspirations regarding capital reallocation in Africa? Are there any specific projects or initiatives that you're working on that I guess you can talk about?
The starting point for me was always around the laws and regulations. And that's why we committed as a firm to working with the World Bank and Insol to enhance insolvency frameworks across Africa. I think that stage of reform is now pretty much complete or well advanced. I mean, reform is a continuous process, it's iterative, it doesn't end. But we've pretty much cracked most of the barriers that we were facing from a legislation point of view. So we need to start moving from reform to recovery. And that's really using those laws and using the insolvency powers that we have to recover assets. So in terms of my aspiration, I mean, as a firm, in the last 8 years, we have recovered a total of $4 billion on behalf of creditors and countries. And this is from over 65 jurisdictions. My personal target is to make sure that most of the funds that we recover and we send back to the respective countries are African funds and are African countries. So if we can have this conversation in a couple of years' time, and I can say to you, right, in the last 18 months, Grant Thornton has recovered $2 billion, of which 1.5 billion went back to Africa, then, I think that will be a success.
Definitely. You touched on an important point. We need to move from reform to recovery. So how do you see the future of capital reallocation evolving in Africa over the next, say, 5 years?
Over the next 5 years, if you look at what's happened in the previous 5 years, the focus has really been on domestic assets recovery, so within the borders of those countries. And the main reason for that is countries really decided to tackle the low-hanging fruits. Unfortunately, what that has meant is the more significant assets being taken out of the countries into overseas territories have not been targeted. Now, due to the fact that most countries are now in a position where they're recovering from COVID, recovering for the war in Ukraine, and the global financial slowdown, these countries are now looking at overseas asset recovery as being a way that they can use to plug the gaps in their finances. So we've received a lot of inquiries from African countries and companies, and local law enforcement, where they're targeting assets that have left their borders for cross-border asset recovery. So I think that's what the future is. The future is an overseas asset recovery.
Interesting. So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and the work that you'll be doing in 5 years' time?
In 5 years' time, doing the same work, but acting on higher value recovery items. Currently, on average, the types of cases we take on when it concerns Africa would be anything from around $25 to $50 million upwards, up to around $500 million upwards. But in future, I think, given that we're moving towards the more difficult, more complex, more significant sums of money that has been stashed away, I think the cases we're going to be looking at would be the higher value items, so in the billions of dollars upwards.
Brilliant. And as you mentioned before, it'd be good to get you back on the podcast in a few years' time to see what capital reallocation in Africa looks like and any new reforms, policies, positive changes that have happened on the continent.
Yes, it'll be a pleasure to come back. And in the meantime, I'll be looking out for future podcasts that you publish for any ideas that I can take on board. Thank you.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
That's an interesting question. I guess I do have one about leadership. Some people say it's controversial, but I say it is personal to me. So if anybody finds this controversial, just know that I'm not speaking about you, I'm speaking about myself. My definition of good leadership is the ability of someone, a person, to use ordinary resources to achieve extraordinary things. And the reason that's important to me is that, there are lots of extraordinary solutions out there that are required to change the fortunes of Africa. And I believe that ordinary people, if they have their skills and their abilities harnessed properly by great leaders, will be able to achieve that change.
I don't see anything controversial in that. I think it's actually a good idea, a good concept, something to definitely live by. No, thank you for sharing that with us today, Amaechi. As we're coming to the close of today's conversation, do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing at Grant Thornton in Africa?
If anyone's listening to this that wants to have a conversation around the work that we're doing, things that we're missing out on certain areas, etc., if they just give me a shout, and I'll be willing to jump on the phone and or grab a coffee. I have never turned down the opportunity to speak to anyone about anything. So that's all I wanted to say in closing, and it's been a pleasure to finally appear on your podcast.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Amaechi. Thank you for this extremely insightful and informative conversation. It's an area that I've not really considered in the past, and I'm happy that you've highlighted this area and demonstrated its huge potential for unlocking Africa's economic potential. So, yeah, thank you for that. It's been a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me today.
Okay, brilliant. Speak soon.
Speak soon. Take care.
Okay, all right, mate. Speak to you soon. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.